I've been thinking a lot lately about what my priorities are. Who do I serve through my actions? What are my influences? Who am I if the self can be reduced to some sort of metadata of my thoughts and actions and experiences? If some kind of AI language model were to look through all of my words, whether spoken, written, and look through all of my actions, interview everyone that has spent a significant amount of time with me in my life, how would it classify me in relation to others? What labels would it put on me, and to what degree? Of course, reduction of nuance into a discrete system is, to some people, almost blasphemous. Nonetheless, if I simply resign myself into the notion that I'm just indescribable or that everything exists in gray areas, I think I miss out on an opportunity for utilizing logical thinking in an area that it might be insightful to apply to despite being imperfect and often misleading. So, by starting at the root of things and building up, taking cues both from Maslow's pyramid and the chakra system, or the idea of the chakra system, I think it's possible to find the most likely prudent path to equanimity. Taking an existentialist mindset crossed with a Cartesian desire to throw out all of the apples on account of the bad ones, I'm going to begin by saying that what we need as individuals is that it's highly individual in most cases, and it's usually based on unprovable or at least unproven axioms and assumptions. While it's impossible to pin down these exact assumptions for everyone, or even for myself, without running into contradictions and a sort of unsolvable Rubik's Cube, if you will, of shifting priorities and dependencies, we as humans have a tendency to try to enumerate some of the axioms, some of the pinpoints that appear fundamental. The two most obvious animators and motivators for our actions, in my opinion, are survival and the divine, whatever that means to the individual person. And even these two seemingly complementary axioms, when taken to extreme cases, become incompatible. When God's will, whatever that means, based on introspection, societal conditioning, and the nature of fate, is at odds with survival, which do we choose? Does everyone have a time to die? Is death just like a part of nature? And even though death is a part of nature, we by design are made to refuse death, any opportunity to strike for as long as we can. So circling back away from the extreme cases, though, survival itself is usually something we take for granted. Assuming we have the means for survival, we are still tasked with asking ourselves what it is we ought to do. Aldous Huxley, in one of his articles that he wrote for Vedanta in the West, talks of a minimum working hypothesis. For him, this minimum working hypothesis, or metaphysical mustard seed, if you will, is a sort of mean between the dogmatic views of traditional religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and the often nihilistic or withdrawn nature of humanism. He frames his hypothesis between what he sees as the extremes of following scripted, dogmatic views that are a mix between good and bad takes, so to speak, and of following the perhaps apathetic or passive views of what he calls sentimental humanism and nature worship. What he arrives at as his conception of this middle way is this, and I'm going to read you his minimum working hypothesis. So, the minimum working hypothesis would seem to run to about this: that there is a Godhead, ground, Brahman, clear light of the void, which is the unmanifested principle of all manifestations. That the ground is at once transcendent and immanent, that it is possible for human beings to love, know, and from virtually to become actually identical with the divine ground. That to achieve this unitive knowledge of the Godhead is the final end and purpose of human existence. That there is a law or dharma which must be obeyed, a Tao or way which must be followed, if men are to achieve their final end. That the more there is of self, the less there is of the Godhead, and that the Tao is therefore a way of humility, and love. The Dharma, a living law of mortification and self-transcending awareness. This, of course, accounts for the facts of history. People like their egos and do not wish to mortify them. Get a bigger kick out of bullying and self-adulation than out of humility and compassion. Are determined not to see why they shouldn't do what they like and have a good time. They get their good time, but also, and inevitably, they get wars and syphilis, tyranny and alcoholism, revolution, and in default of an adequate religious hypothesis, the choice between, I gotta change the page, sorry, some lunatic idolatry such as nationalism, and a sense of complete futility and despair, unutterable miseries. But throughout recorded history, the great majority of men and women have preferred the risk to know the positive certainty of such disasters to the tiresome whole-time job of seeking first the kingdom of God. In the long run, we get exactly what we ask for. So basically, in my opinion, he's saying that somewhere out there is a God that has a plan and a divine law to be followed. Nonetheless, we are not always, if ever, sure of what that law is and means for us as individuals, as well as us as a society. Intertwined with his view of this Godhead or divine ground is the notion that the ego, or our human desire for more of self, more pleasure for self, more power for self, more praise for self, more ease and comfort for self, is, for the most part, an obstacle to the union with this law or Godhead or divine ground. He says seeking first the kingdom of heaven is our solution to avoid so many of our conflicts and disasters that us humans tend to create for ourselves. Based on this, it's tempting to call on an abstraction or tautology such as doing God's will as our first priority. While I certainly agree that doing God's will is the most important and fundamental maxim, I'm also not naive enough, at least anymore, to assume that I know what that means or that others and I will have the same idea in our head when we think of God's will. Besides being nearly delusionally self-righteous, the notion that I myself can put into words the unutterable and perhaps unknowable understanding of what is absolutely ethical or wise or best for my fellow men is simply impractical. Not every truth must be immediately perceptible as transcendent or coming back to a cosmologically significant standpoint, even if you believe everything has meaning. To use a rather liberally applied metaphor, the baker doesn't have to be consciously aware of the symbolism, scientific workings, or divine origin of bread to make delicious bread for his neighbors and for himself. He just has to know intimately his process of baking, a filtering of his creative force through the medium of wheat grain and heat, tempered by the expansive restraints of artisanal ancestors and the taste of his contemporaries. My point is that there is truth and merit in the notion that total awareness of everything, certainty, and a one-to-one correspondence between the world itself and your brain's perception and memory of the world is both impossible and impractical to chase. While looking for God through the truth, we sometimes create an idol out of the truth. God is the truth, but the truth is not God. I believe there is a divine ground, or God, that has a law, or logos, or divine word. However, I do not believe this is fully understandable in terms of words or symbols used by me or any other human. Obsessing over right and wrong, good and evil, can be counterproductive at times. Despite this, I recognize the need for axioms. I am a logical person. I know not everyone is, but I am. We can hold on to beliefs to try and get to God, but only through his help can we succeed. The beliefs are not God himself. What I recognize is that I need action. I may say things that are inaccurate, do things that are wrong, perceive things in short-sighted ways, and think and analyze with my own interest or my ego's best interest in mind. Despite this, I have to try. I have to try something. You know, it's really tempting to get caught up in this log jam or this kind of over-analyzing mode when we try to stick to precepts or, you know, laws or a sort of legal code of how to live our life. But yeah, despite this, we have to try. Rumi said, as you begin to walk on the way appears. This small amount of faith, this mystic germ, gives me hope that I can practice towards being the person I ought to be, even if the person I ought to be doesn't actually exist or maybe never can exist. St. Augustine said, "It is the function of perfection to make one know one's imperfections."